All right.
These actually ring a bell.
Yeah, but Ken fell.
Ken's bell.
Ken is able to fall. Good morning. Um, kind of vent about driving for a little bit.
Oh, boy.
No, I have to laugh. It was, I was not the offended party this morning. Um, One of the things I've noticed is that apparently they don't teach the proper use of turn signal in driver training anymore. Meaning that, so there are people who just don't know that they have a turn signal, which is one thing, but more than that, a turn signal is meant to communicate what you're going to do, not what you expect everybody else to do. So, for example, I'm crossing the Selwood Bridge this morning, and it merges into two lanes, and by and large, I have to say, going across the Selwood Bridge, people are pretty good about this, right? Very little passive aggressive on that anyway. This morning, there was very little traffic on the Selwood Bridge, not many people driving on Sunday morning, from Mother's Day or whatever. And I'm behind two cars that are currently parallel on the bridge with the merge lane coming. And the car on the left is not speeding up or slowing down, they're continuing about their business. The car on the right, which is maybe half a car length ahead of the car on the left, decides they need to merge, and so they put their turn signal on. The car on the left sees that their turn signal is on and is waiting for them to merge, because if there's space before the car, space behind the car, and you are merging, you do actually communicating. If you speed up and you slow down to fit the traffic, and they did not. Instead, two cars ran parallel, with the car on the right waiting for the car on the left to slow down or speed up, and they didn't. They weren't being a jerk either, because I was behind them. They were maintaining consistent speed, giving the opportunity, until finally the lane ended, and two of them had to come up with a choice what we're going to do, and they both pulled brakes. And it was so funny, because the car on the left, I could see, was trying not to be angry, and I just saw them shaking their head in the silhouette. But they had a nice Ranger truck, so they probably didn't want to risk being. Anyways, I laughed and laughed and laughed. Okay, we are finally at the point where we're talking about the modern picture of Judaism. We're getting to what Judaism is like currently, right? How many of you recognize this word? Hasidic, or Hasidic Jews, you've heard. So this is one of the, it's not really a misconception. You see a man, generally a man, in a black suit, right? With maybe there's a fringe poking out below the suit jacket with white. And our first instinct is to refer to them as a Hasidic or Orthodox Jew. Not necessarily true. In fact, where I live over in southwest Portland, near in the Burlington area, right? So near the Burlington Red Myers, there's a large Jewish community, very large. Also, I found out something really fascinating. I should have looked it up. I should have looked it up. Did you know that Jewish communities, especially Jewish communities that tend to follow halakha or kosher more tightly, have essentially areas that are outlined in their neighborhood by wire that indicates that in that area on Sabbath they can walk about freely and carry things. Yeah, well, yes and no. There's actually a name for the wire. Hold on. Round. Okay, hold on, check it out. Eruv. There's one that's around all of Manhattan. Okay, because the whole thing is in the Talmud, there's an interpretation of the prohibition against working that tells you how far you can walk while carrying something, and it's something like 4 cubits. You can only walk 4 cubits, which I don't remember the conversion of cubits yard, but it's not very far. Which, if you are in your neighborhood on a Saturday morning, is very inconvenient, especially if you want to take, for example, a brisket or casserole over to your neighbor's house. And so what they do in Jewish neighborhoods is they run a wire called an Arab around the neighborhood, which essentially distinguishes it as a household. So you can, within your household, you can walk about freely carrying things, but the Arab is what demarcates a neighborhood or household you can carry, your brisket over to your neighbor's house.
Isn't the cubit this?
I remember. Yeah, could be. Yeah. because Noah's Ark was 200 cubits or something like that. And they say it's about 100 yards long or whatever. I think it's right. Yeah, cubit. Thereabouts.
Or cubits isn't very long.
No, it's not very long. You barely get outside your door. Anyways.
I think this is my Highland Park was really right by Rutgers University. The neighborhood had Jews everywhere, and on Saturday, when they were walking around, the child set the pace for how fast they would walk. And so if the child was playing, they were playing with the child. You can see these mittens coming
Yeah.
around the child. They could go as far as one until they were playing. So they were walking long distances with kids, and it looked like they were going anywhere almost. But they were.
That is funny.
It is, yeah.
Well, I thought you could walk the arm and then you put something down and then you can pick it up and start over.
Oh, that would be, yeah, that might be a way to game the system. This is an interesting thought. But I'm just fascinated by that. In fact, so my segue was the neighborhood, the Jewish neighborhood near me, Essex Arab. You can actually see the map of where the Arab extends street by street. And basically, it's strung along the telephone poles. It's up above the telephone, the power phone wires. Yeah. But what I was saying is that you see somebody in dark clothing with a fringe and stuff like that, we immediately, well, I don't know what to do. But there's a tendency to assume that that's a Hasidic Jew, and in reality, probably not. Hasidism, or Hasidic Jews, comprise only about 160,000 people. So it's a relatively small movement, even in the context of Judaism and Christianity. Somewhere between 12 and 18 million people, so the book that I'm primarily using, which is the History of Judaism by Martin Goodman, talks about the difficulty in measuring Judaism in the modern era, and a lot of it has to do with how people identify as Jewish. How in Israel especially, there's a large proportion of Jews that are secular Jews. So it's not worshiping, but they identify ethnically or genealogically as Jewish. And so the question in determining population is like how you numerate, is it people who are practicing Judaism, is that the number, in which case it's closer to 12 million, or is everybody who identifies as Jewish, which is closer to 18 million. Well, now you know.
And they're having lots of children in.
Lots of children, but then also there's lots of immigration out of Israel, believe it or not, with the United States being the primary destination, which kind of makes sense in light of the violence and conflict. It's not exactly a super great place to be raising kids in this era that we're in. So we'll get to that. We'll talk about that maybe probably next week when we talk about numbers and population transitions and all that stuff. Today, we're talking a little bit about Hasidism, and then we're going to be talking about Reform Judaism. Hasidism starts in the 18th century, so 1750s, and it starts with a couple of dudes, and the guy who kind of like popularized it, for lack of a better word, his name is Dober. And he is the person that is essentially recognized as the face eventually, right? For whatever reason, he's the one that starts to break out of Hasidism. But he points to a guy named Israel ben Eliezer as the originator of Hasidism. So in other words, he claims to have learned from this Israel ben Eliezer about this Hasidism. Now, last week, we talked about the different forms of Kabbalah, right? Okay. We talked about Lurianic Kabbalah, who was started by a guy named Spanish guy named Luria. And Lurianic Kabbalah is a mystical Judaism that really becomes popular in the 15th to 17th centuries. And what we were talking about last week is we were kind of talking about the philosophical, also the cultural origins of what eventually becomes modern Judaism. Because again, what's going on during this period is lots of transition in terms of how human beings see themselves, how they see their world, and especially where they live, and their religions, right? So one of the big movements that happens during this time period is the Enlightenment, right? And in Western Europe, especially, you can point to things like the French Revolution as symptoms of that transition. And, well, Judaism is not absent from that. Judaism goes through a similar shift in their philosophy, how they think about their religion, changing over the course of this time period. Because again, we are now 17th century removed from Temple Judaism. And so this is going to be something that we're going to talk a lot about, especially when we get to talk about Reform Judaism, is why things change the way they do. And a lot of it has to do with coming to terms that there is no longer going to be a period in which Judaism exists in the temple anymore, right? For centuries afterwards, that continued to be a hope and kind of philosophy of Judaism. But at some point, there's a split amongst Jews over whether we give up on that idea or we double down on that idea. You essentially have two branches of Judaism. One is what we refer to as, cultural modern Judaism, which is, okay, what does Judaism look like after Israel, right? And not just in terms of possessing the temple, but we're no longer a nation, right? So you'll hear phrases like the nation of Israel, okay? We're no longer a nation. We are people that live all over the place. And so we're no longer thinking about Judaism as comprising a people, but rather a religion. And this seems like really strange to us in the modern era because we're used to thinking about religion as something that is separate from our state or separate from our cultural identity, even though we're not that far removed from it, right? How many of you are descended from Scandinavians or Germanic peoples, right? How many of you remember when the word Lutheran was prefaced by Norwegian Lutheran Church or the German Lutheran Church, or if you're not from a Lutheran tradition, you can identify the Episcopalians from the Lutherans from Methodists by each of their last name, right? Where I grew up, we could tell the Catholics from everybody else because their names all ended in SKI. They were all Polish. We had a lot of large Polish Catholic contingent in Michigan. So we're not that far removed from it, but what's remarkable is if you think about how we see ourselves in terms of religious people in the modern world, I talked about this last week in the sermon, is we tend to think about it as a choice, but also as something that transcends your cultural identity, right? This is something that can happen, change in thinking, and that's what's going on for Judaism post-Enlightenment, is we're no longer the nation of Israel. We are now a religion that transcends necessarily, cultural relevance. Or you go the other direction, which a significant minority, I should say, a significant minority chooses to do, which this is where Zionism comes out, which we'll talk about eventually. Okay. That's where we're headed. We're talking about Hasidism today. Think about Hasidism as kind of like the Pentecostal movement within Judaism, but with a very kind of fundamentalist Orthodox approach thrown into it. So Bill Bear is the guy that's kind of encountered by the public, pointing to this guy, Israel ben Eliezer, as the originator of it. Israel ben Eliezer was a huge proponent and student of Hurriyam and Kabbalah, and we talked about this a bit last week, but he is referred to as the Baal Shem, which means the master of the holy name, the master of the name of God. And this was, again, kind of a part of Kabbalah. And if you want to study more about Kabbalah, go for it. There's a lot there to read, a ton to read, okay? And one of the, again, we talked about it last week, and we, it's a complicated thing, but it's a very broad thing as well, too. Kabbalah went in a bunch of different directions, and not all of it is the same. But kind of core and central to it was the idea that you are essentially getting closer to God, right? By becoming the master of God's name, you are becoming more intimately connected to the nature of creation. Does that kind of track? I've talked about a concept that comes out of Kabbalah before, which is the concept of tikkun olam. Remember when I talked about this way back? Probably not. Tikkun olam comes out of this idea, which is a very Kabbalic concept, which is that the world is broken, right? And the world is fractured through sinfulness and not following the law, and that we each carry a spark of the broken world or the broken divinity within us, and that by following the law, we put it back together. So this is a concept that was central to Urianic Kabbalism and carries into Hasidism as well, too. So at its heart, what the Hasidic movement is about it's about ecstatic experience, believe it or not. There's a lot of again, similarities to kind of the Pentecostal concept of, they don't necessarily refer to the Holy Spirit, but being united with the essence of God. And it manifests in a bunch of different ways. So where we run into this dude is there's a different guy whose name is Solomon Lyman, not Maimonides, a totally different who at that point in his life was a very secular Jew. Again, this is during kind of like the mid-Enlightenment, 1750s. And he is invited to meet this dude. And he shows up at his house and has this really trippy experience where he walks in and everybody's silent. Nobody's talking. They're all just kind of sitting there, and it's kind of like they're waiting for the doe bear to show up. And this guy walks in, and he's dressed completely in white, head to toe. He's got a long white beard, long white hair, and he starts to just basically ecstatically preach. No introduction, just walks into the room and starts talking about scripture and talking about all this stuff. And he goes on for like 45 minutes, and at the end of it, Lyman converts. It's like he was a skeptic going in without being totally convinced of the holiness of the doe bear. So these two guys are responsible for starting. What happens is that it branches, because what you get over the next 100 years or so is people who are identified as leaders within the Hasidic movement, who essentially gather groups of people around themselves. And we see this similarly. It's kind of like the equivalent of a yogi, right, or a spiritual leader within a movement. So here's how you can recognize, not that we're necessarily trying to spot Hasidic Jews in the wild, but generally, if you kind of distinguish a Hasidic Jew, there's going to be a unique form of headdress. So if you've seen pictures of you encounter people that have like those big cylindrical fur hats, that is one expression of which teacher or there's a term for them. Hold on. They have a specific name where they call their people. Rebbe, which comes from rabbi, which Rebbe they follow. Okay? And these rebels gather communities around themselves and as religious movement want to do. So now keep in mind, in terms of the number of specific Jews in the world, it's a very small fraction of Judaism, even if you're counting the 12 million as the religious post. So don't make that mistake. However, if you travel to Jerusalem, you will see a lot of Hasidic Jews. I kind of spot all the different head coverings and stuff that were ones that are interesting. So, okay. Any questions, comments?
In New York City, there's been a lot more, really say, living with the wigs, and
Yep.
they're not too positive?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. And again, this is something we're going to talk about as well too, which is the style of dress that Hasidism espouses is a snippet of mine. It's essentially what noble Polish people dressed like in the late 18th, early 19th century. And here's why. We're going to talk about statistics of populations now. This is a great segue into that. Okay. We're going to go in reverse timeline. So we've already talked about the fact that there's somewhere between 12 and 18 million Jewish folks in our world today. Okay. Where do all these people live? United States, these are the two places that the majority of Jews live in the modern era. So about yes, it's about equal numbers. So roughly 7 million. Yeah. Yes, and then this was surprising to me is that the other, well, again, this is 14 million right here, but the remainder of the next largest population is in France. France holds some of the biggest population of Judaism, which is remarkable to me because one of the things that I've encountered in French culture is the kind of offhand anti-Semitism that is right throughout French culture, which we'll talk about that. That's also, I have intimate experience with this. France, or as politically and culturally progressive as we view Western Europe to be, France has its pieces which are extremely conservative, especially from a progressive Western mindset. For example, my wife's mother, women weren't allowed to hold a checking account until 1970. So before that, their husbands could only pay for them. They were allowed to have a savings account, but they weren't allowed to write checks. And as a consequence, French men tend to be, from a Western perspective, from American perspective, a little bit misogynistic. Ron's father was exactly that in a lot of ways, but that's a story for different day. So, yeah, France is the next largest population, and then we've got Jews that are in the Middle East, well, also in the Middle East, Egypt, North Africa, spread around different parts of Western Europe as well too. But the key thing to keep in mind is modern era, these are your two major populations. And again, what's fascinating is how these populations are moving back and forth. When things are good, a lot of American Jews are moving to Israel. When things are not so good, like right now, going in the reverse direction. And it's complicated. It's complicated. By and large, it's the wealthier folks that are moving out of Israel into the U.S. And at the same time, there are recruitment methods that are used to essentially bring American Jews over and show them the glories of living in Israel. We'll talk about that eventually. But just understand that this is what it looks like in 2024. Rewind. So, what was Judaism? What was the population of Judaism prior to 1939? Okay, so this is kind of like the snapshot in time. We know that roughly 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust, which, if you think about it, is over half of the Jewish population that existed in the world at that point in time. Because in 1939, we have around 10 to 11 million Jews. Okay, and guess where they all lived? Not Germany. There was a significant population in Germany. Poland. They all lived in Poland. So Poland held something like, I can refer to my notes, but I think it was something like 7 million Jews at that point in time. Or 5 million. So, one of the reasons why, if you have a stereotype of what Judaism looks like, you have again a man in a dark suit with the fringe poking out below. It's literally a cincture, a belt that they wear around their waist that has a fringe attached to it. Sometimes wearing varying forms of head coverings. If they're wearing like a fedora, like a brim hat, that's not Hasidic. If they're wearing, what we might refer to as a yarmulke, or what's the other term? Yes. If they're wearing the cap over the back part of their head, that's just a head covering. It doesn't indicate anything with regards to their practices. If you are trying to identify a Hasidic Jew, a good place to start is they have huge, well, it varies in size. They have pretty remarkable looking hat of some sort, some kind of fur.
It's weird.
It's weird. Yeah. It's
It's this big around.
Yeah.
It
looks like an oven. It looks like an oven.
On top of your head.
On top of your head, yeah. And the majority of Hasidic Jews, at least in the 17th and 18th, or 18th and 19th centuries, were in Russia. Russia and Ukraine. Okay. Keep in mind that there's a big purge that happens in Ukraine at some point, which caused a lot of Ukrainian Jews to move out of Ukraine into Russia and Poland. But we're going backwards in time. So 1939, the majority of Jews in the world are living in Poland. This is what I find so tragic and fascinating, is that Germany, Nazi Germany, which ends up, you all know the history, but ends up developing this demonization of Judaism, blaming all of their economic and cultural problems on the threat of a Jew, doesn't even have 1 million Jews living in Germany. They're across the border. So here's one of the things that is important to understand about history of World War II as well, too, is it's about expansionism. Is that they're trying to essentially come up with a reason to invade Poland, which they do, right? So why do modern Jews, essentially have that kind of dress? Because that was the dress of Judaism during that point in time. So we're talking about our so we've got our Ashkenazi Jews. That's who's living there. Okay. So again, I hesitate to compare this to Amish because it's not necessarily about trying to freeze that point in time. It's they're going through a religious and cultural shift by identifying who they are, and it happens to just occur during that point in time. And keep in mind that Judaism is a lot about what's appropriate and what is, I hesitate to use the terms of clean and unclean, but what is halakha? What does it mean to follow the law? And so you can look at the Talmud for examples of how Judaism at points in time really drills down how do we make sure that we keep this law? Right? How do we make sure that we don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, and kind of the concentric circles of the practices that form around that? How do we make sure that we don't do work on Shabbat? Go as far as establishing a wire around our neighborhood to permit us to travel freely. Okay, you can imagine that what you wear factors significantly in how you follow halakha, how you keep the law, how you keep the Sabbath, right? And so that's a big part of it. And keep in mind that that type of dress varies depending on which Jewish culture you're talking about, but it's kind of similar to how we used to and still do wear a Sunday best. So you're not going to see if you go over to South Burlingame on Wednesday morning, you're not going to see a bunch of people walking around in that dress. If you go there Friday evening, Saturday morning, absolutely, because all the kids are out in the street, they're all wearing their and all the men and women with different forms of covering. Sorry, I'm spitballing a bunch of different information. The head covering originates during this time as well too, which is something that I found very fascinating. I just assumed that the head covering is a tradition that goes way back to Judaism. It's not. It actually originates during this period of spiritual revival. And I think it's a rabbi out of England starts this practice of wanting to cover his head, especially when he prays. But where does he get that from? Islam. So it actually comes out of an Islamic practice which gets adopted by Judaism and then eventually becomes a part of what they do as well too. And it originates out of this guy, I think he was living in some Islamic country, moved to England, he brought the practice with and stuff and everybody else adopted it. To the point nowadays where you walk into a Jewish place of worship and men have head coverings.
I always heard there were two ways to be Jewish. One to be born there, or and the other is the religion.
This is fascinating because this is the current debate. This is really where Judaism is struggling right now, is in terms of that identity, because that has come down to it. Part of this, when we talk about the matrilineal tracing of Judaism, is a part of that. But more than that, and again, it's fascinating how cultural practices are shaped by tragedy. Was during the Third Reich in Germany, there was actually a profound attempt to try and identify exactly who's Jewish and who's not. And the way that it was defined by Nazi Germany was essentially, if you have 3 grandparents that are Jewish, that makes you Jewish. And so there were actually quite a few people that were arrested and later killed, exterminated, who were practicing Christians, but because 3 of their grandparents were Jewish, they were identified as culturally and ethnically Jewish. Listen, again, what's going on? We're jumping ahead in time a little bit, but we can move back. What's going on scientifically during this period as well? Eugenics. What's eugenics about?
Good genes.
Good genes, yes. Not about genes. It's about genes. Because one of the scientific breakthroughs that we have is the discovery of DNA and the concept of genes, the sequence, the human genome, and all this stuff. And so, kids with fire in terms of understanding what makes up a human being. And one of the theories, scientific theories that's coming out of this time is the idea that your genes determine who you are, and therefore there are good genes and there are bad genes, which ends up being fodder for a lot of racism and prejudice, right? So you will be a lot of fascinating and horrifying studies that come out of the late 19th and 20th century talking about inferiority of African populations because of, again, they base it on cranial size and all kinds of different things. The inferiority, and this was essentially the theory that was espoused by the Third Reich, was that Jews, because they have been separate, and again, the irony of this is fascinating, but because Judaism has primarily been separate from the rest of the populations, they lived in ghettos, they lived on their own, has essentially a completely separate genome, that they are genetically inferior to the, what, the Nazis are calling the Aryan race, which is a fascinating fictitious concept that does not exist, especially from the perspective of modern science. What's ironic about all of this is that prior to this, Judaism is going through this really tough thing of trying to figure out how do we determine or how do we identify as Jewish? Because I mentioned at the beginning, what's going on as well too is that this large segment of Judaism, which is like, we're no longer an ethnicity, we're no longer a nation, right? We're not a tribe anymore. Jew, you can convert to Judaism, right? That's a thing that comes about with Reform Judaism especially. But also, even if you are, you can trace your Jewish history back through your grandparents, your mother, whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be practicing as a Jew. And in Britain especially, there's a lot of crossing between Christianity and Judaism, with Jews converting to Christianity and vice versa. This is post-World War II. So one of the questions that we're struggling with is how do you identify as a Jew? And what's remarkable is there's a huge push for whether or not you're practicing, which is in sharp contrast to this idea that it's about your ethnicity, right? So it's an interesting thing. We'll talk even more about that next week. When we get to, like, I've already spoiled the view over. I've already spoiled this a little bit, but fascinating stuff. 19th century. So, how do we group Judaism from a modern perspective? Way back in the first couple of classes, we talked about this. I'm going to draw a spectrum, but this is not necessarily scientifically accurate. It's more qualitative analysis of Judaism. So on one end of the spectrum is what is known as Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism is the only official denomination, to use that word, that exists within Judaism. In other words, there is a literal denomination in the United States called the Reform denomination of Judaism. Okay? In the 19th century, it begins a movement that later kind of crystallizes into what becomes a denomination. We're going to call that progressive Judaism, for lack of a better word. In the center, we have this really interesting term, which is conservative, which, again, from our perspective, we take to mean one thing, which in French we would say it's opposed to meaning, it's a false term. It's not really what this word means. Conservative Judaism ends up being a reaction to Reform Judaism, but conservative Judaism is farther along the spectrum than its neighbors to the right, which we tend to lump together in this term that we call Orthodox. And this is really an external term that's applied to something that's much more complex and nuanced than you can just lump into Orthodox Judaism. Because what does Orthodox Judaism include? Orthodox Judaism might include Hasidism, or Orthodox Judaism might include specific synagogues, depending on their interpretation of the Talmud, their practices. But by and large, we use this term to describe folks who really more closely follow the Talmud and Halacha. Right? So a lot of emphasis on kosher practice, a lot of emphasis on Shabbat practices and all that stuff. But again, it's a spectrum, and I kind of did a bad job of drawing a spectrum, indicating that the divide between conservative and Orthodox isn't necessarily a clean cut either. There's a smaller spectrum that exists in there as well too. Reform and eventually conservative Judaism comes out of the mid-19th century in Germany. So prior to a lot of Jews moving to Poland, there was a pretty large population of Judaism in Germany. Where you actually get a lot of people moving is before and after the First World War as well. So you get a lot of people moving out of Germany because of the effects of the Great War at that time. But additionally, there's a lot of stuff that happens towards the end of the 19th century that causes some migration of folks, which again, if you're interested in the nuances of population migration and stuff like that, Goodman's book was a great detail. And probably there's probably a good Wikipedia article about it as well too. But to kind of just compress this into a short statement is prior to the 19th century, Judaism is pretty broadly dispersed. Again, if you go back to it's not necessarily in Western Europe as much. They're in Northern Africa, they're in Spain, which I guess is Western Europe. They're in Egypt, they're in the Middle East, what we refer to as the Middle East. But what happens over time is Judaism eventually ends up migrating into Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. So Romania, Hungary, Germany, Poland, those areas, right? Which kind of means this is where we're at now. But even in the late 19th century, there's a lot of movement back and forth, from Germany to Ukraine to Russia to Poland, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Middle of the 19th century Germany, and there are a couple of guys that are at the center of the reform movement, and one of the guys' names is, I've got it here. I have it here. The problem is I've got 15 tabs open. What happened to my tab? Oh, shoot. Well, we'll come back to his name. Oh, there we go. Oh, no, that's the critic. I'll get the name before the end of the class. So there are a couple of Jews, just take my word for it, in 1853-ish, that take it upon themselves to readapt Judaism, okay? And the central question is essentially the one that I posited at the beginning, which is, what does it mean to be a Jew in a world where we're no longer a nation? And where they arrive at is that we need to become a religion. And not only a religion, but a universal religion. And then again, this seems like such a strange concept to us who in the 21st century just kind of take it for granted that every religion assumes to be universal. And what I mean by that is that everybody in the world is going to be this religion at some point in time, as being kind of a central concept that exists with it. Christianity, every knee shall bow, every name, every tongue shall confess the name of the Lord, etc. That kind of exists in our consciousness. Islam is our Islam, the idea that someday all the world will be Muslim. And again, this isn't necessarily about conquest, it's about how we understand, the end of the world, so to speak, how we understand the fulfillment of all things. Judaism doesn't really have that until the 19th century, because who are Jews, or who are the people who identify as Jewish? They're the people who are representing the people that used to live in Israel. Right? That is essentially how they identify themselves. And even within ancient Judaism, right, who are Hebrews? They are the chosen people, which is a subset of the overall world population. They are the people who have been chosen by God to heal the world, right? What happens when that tribal or that ethnic identity, that sense of we are the specific people, what happens when that no longer exists? And that's what these guys are confronting. So they're like, what does Judaism mean if we're no longer the specific people to heal the world? And essentially what comes out is the idea that, well, we need to be a universal religion. And there's justification for that as well too, because especially within the Hebrew scriptures, we have language talking about this is the God of all creation, right? This is the God of Israel, but also the God, we read people like Jonah, the God who saved the people of Nineveh. There is a sense of this being a universal deity that exists within Jewish thought, but it just never really manifested. And so the folks who start the Reform movement essentially decide that we need to reform Judaism in that image, which is now the idea that Judaism is a religion, not necessarily an identity. Does that make sense? And I find this, again, I find a lot of things really fascinating, but I find it fascinating in critiquing how we see the world today, taking for granted that religion is a choice. Right? Yeah, we might be born to Lutheran parents, but we decide whether we want to continue with Lutheran tradition. We might be born to a Christian identity, but we might decide to leave that behind. But this is all kind of being explored during this period of time, is this idea that, excuse me, the mustache in my mouth. You might not necessarily be what you are born, right? And the thing is, too, is they're interested. Thanks, guys. We're all clustered right here, all the mustaches. But this goes the reverse direction as well, too, which is that if we're a universal religion, then we need to make this accessible to other people, right? It can't just be those who have Jewish mothers or Jewish grandparents or whoever you want to identify. We need to be a religion that is open to folks, and not just open in terms of like you can convert, but open in terms of like it makes sense in a modern world. And the things that they kind of identified that were tough from a modern perspective to work with, and even in the middle of the 19th century, we have the Industrial Revolution coming upon, the world changing along with technology and all the things that are coming out of that, is how do you practice halacha in a world where there are automobiles and trains and you're expected to potentially work on Fridays and all of these complex things. And so what the reformers set about doing is essentially detaching these things from the identity of Judaism. And again, I can't really give you a list of things that they cut out, because they don't necessarily see it as cutting it out of Judaism, they see it as leaving it behind. And again, another thing that's happening is, during or post-Enlightenment, is it's a historical critical method of reading Scripture, which is understanding Scripture, whether it's the Torah or the Talmud, in the context in which it's written. And so these guys are reading the Torah and they're saying, you know what, who are these people? These are people that lived 2,500 years ago, right? These prohibitions on mixed fabrics or, not being shellfish might have made sense in their context, but essentially are preventing us from joining the modern world, is what they're saying, okay? And so one of their major goals is, what does a modern Judaism look like? So what does a Judaism look like that can exist in this modern setting where determining if something is kosher or not is a lot tougher than it was, 2,000 years before. And so what happens is they begin this process of creating these different reforms. And you have a bunch of different reformers. There's a bunch of different people that are involved in this that essentially found communities around themselves. But a lot of it is very intellectual. They're writing books, they're writing papers, they're discussing and debating it. This is the Enlightenment after all. And they don't agree with each other a lot of the time. In fact, it gets really rough. There's a lot of infighting that occurs during this period where one guy's like, I think we should give up, the milk and meat thing, and another guy's like, no, we can't get that behind, So they're kind of going back and forth. What happens is, as what eventually becomes Reform Judaism is kind of cohesing, is then there's kind of a splinter that happens, which is where eventually conservative Judaism comes out of. Which conservative Judaism comes out of this idea, and this is a little bit of a gross simplification. Again, if you want a more in-depth reading on it, we'll get the we'll go into depth on it. But where conservative Judaism comes out of is, well, yeah, we want to get Judaism in the modern world, but we're not ready to leave all those things behind. Is that there are still practices that are central to who we are and what our identity is, and it's not so easy as saying, I guess we're not going to worry about that anymore. But, and again, this is the important thing to understand these two movements, is they're both intended to modernize Judaism. In other words, making Judaism more accessible to a modern human being. With the intent that, if you want to become Jewish, you can take that process. Which, and I can't belabor this enough. I can't express this enough. Is a really new thought that exists during this time period. The idea that you can become another thing rather than remaining the thing that you're born, right? That you can become a Jew even though you were born in a Christian family or vice versa. It doesn't really exist in the world consciousness significantly before this point. Unless you're talking about Sabbatai Sethi, who we talked about last week, who was the self-declared Messiah that converted to Islam after he met the Sultan. That's another story. Okay, Paul, we're talking about. What do you think, Linda?
Well, I listened to you say that, and it flashed in my brain that
when I was in Houston, my bosses were Jewish. And I was invited to their house many times for dinners and events. And I don't know if it was logistics, but instead of having two kitchens, one kosher and one that you could do normal cooking, they would have, they only had one kitchen.
Yeah.
But they had a separate set of pans and a separate set of dishes. And there were certain foods that might not be kosher, but you couldn't eat them on certain days.
On Shabbat or on a festival, yeah.
So they kind of had both worlds.
Yes, and this is exactly what we're talking about. So my friend Brian converted to Judaism about 3 years ago, and he was raised evangelical fundamentalist Christian, departed that lifestyle, ended up going to Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which is where he met my friend Anna, and they eventually got married. And he continued to identify in the Christian environment up until about 3 years ago. And he ended up converting for lots of reasons. But, you know, a large part of it was that the Torah in his book, right? It's what he said day in, day out. And so he was immersed in that lifestyle. When he converted in a Reformed congregation. The way that he did that is he identified a rabbi, he shopped, like everybody does. He went online, researched the different congregations that are in his area, found one that he liked, met with the rabbi, and expressed his intent to convert. Then had about a year period where he went to adult classes. He went to these classes, and he's already fluent in Hebrew because he has a doctorate in Jewish study, or Hebrew study. But he basically went through the same classes that every convert would go through, which is learning the Torah and different aspects of Jewish history and life. At the end of it, his practices are completely up to him. So he doesn't eat pork anymore, but he still eats shellfish. He still eats cheeseburgers. He doesn't. He will go to Shabbat services from time to time, but he doesn't necessarily worry about the prohibition of pork on Fridays and Saturdays. He sees it as an opportunity to remind himself of the rest on the weekends. But by and large, his Jewishness is determined by his understanding of it, right? And that's just an example of what it looks like to exist within kind of modern Judaism, right? Which again is why, you know, when we think about what are your practices as a Christian, the first question we ask is, well, what's your denomination, right? Or what church do you go to? I mean, since denominations are kind of, you know, out of style in the modern era. And we identify what you do based on which movement you belong to. It's almost the opposite when it comes to Reformed Judaism, is that Reformed Judaism is essentially kind of this opportunity for you to exist within the world of Judaism, but at your own pace. And that's not to say that they don't have debates about theology, all the things that go hand in hand with being a religion. But what's remarkable about Judaism in general, which, you know, I commented on and Paul has commented on, is there are very few, almost no examples of knockdown, drag-out fights that lead to people alienating or demonizing each other. Because despite the fact that conservative Reform Judaism kind of come out in opposition, it's a very genial opposition. Now, these folks essentially identify, you know what, this reform movement was a good idea, but we're not, we like this version of it, which we maintain a little bit more of identity. And there is no conservative denomination, right? Conservative Judaism is a kind of a catch-all term that describes, again, this kind of middle point of the Jewish spectrum. There are congregations that will identify themselves as being conservative Jewish congregations, and there will be congregations that don't. But we probably fall into that. Does that make sense? I found names. So the two guys who were responsible for kind of kicking off the reform were a guy named Lazarus Ben David and a guy named David Friedlander. Friedlander. This is a very good German name. There, I told you I found it. Okay, we're a couple of really interesting things to close. So again, during this time period, there's also, and so there's so many things that have been that we're trying to figure out, right? What do our practices look like? What do our buildings look like? What does our music look like? So what happens during the 19th century is that you actually get a lot of interplay between Christianity and Judaism. Because it's also like during the Enlightenment, it's this great time where we realize that we can talk to people of different faiths and not have to kill them, right? We can actually have open conversations about theology and philosophy, and it's okay to believe in the philosophy and vice versa. And so what you get is you get a lot of cultural crossover that happens. So one of the things that happens in many Jewish congregations who are kind of falling into this Reform and conservative movement is that in many ways they're becoming more church-like. So they adopt organ music, which did not exist, prior to this. They adopt organ music. Many of their rabbis are now encouraged by their congregations to preach sermons, which I have to laugh at because, again, from a Protestant perspective, sermonizing is essentially someone, and that's all I do. Right? I show up on Sundays, I preach, and I go home and prepare my sermon. I'm being facetious, but sermons, preaching are kind of this core part of Protestant identity. But prior to that, it was primarily teaching, which, again, because of my style of preaching, there's a lot of crossover there. But, teaching in terms of you open up the scroll, you open up the Torah, you pick up a passage, and you teach on it. But their congregations want preaching like all their Christian friends do, where it's expository and they tell fun stories about their kids and stuff like that. I don't know what preaching is like in the 19th century. I don't think it was necessarily like that. But one of the other fascinating things, especially in conservative Judaism, when Reform is giving up a lot of or leaving behind a lot of the halacha practices, is conservative Judaism is like, okay, but how do we keep these halacha practices in a modern world? For example, the fringe that I talked about is specifically important, which I forgot. But in the Talmud, there's a verse that essentially describes that the fringe is something that is attached, is sewn onto your garment. And the question comes up is, in this industrialized society, is it okay for the fringes to be attached by sewing machines? Which seems strange, but the answer they come up with is no, because the intent they understood, the intent of this passage in the Talmud was that you are intentionally attaching the fringe to your garment as a way of signifying something. And so it needs to be attached by hand by a person that knows what they're doing, not by some mindless machine that's just But then the other things that they end up debating are things like, is it okay for food to be canned, which seems like a strange thing. But if you don't know where that metal came from or where, what went in it before, especially when you're talking about stuff like matzah, matzo ball soup, okay, which is Passover food, yes, which is one of the foods that's eaten on Passover. The question was, can this be industrially made? In other words, can this be turned out in the factory and put into jars and cans and opened by Jews on, for Passover or whatever, to be used in matzo ball soup? And they ended up deciding, absolutely. It's a pain in the butt to make matzah. Better that people are able to eat matzah and not have to make it on their own than not have it, at all. So these are the fascinating things that kind of come out of it. And you can read a lot about this as well too, depending on Goodman's book or Wikipedia articles. But these are the things that I find very fascinating to think about: is how do human beings adapt our world, our changing world, to meet our religious identity, which I find especially inspiring when we think about the things the changes that we have seen within our timeline, how we adapt to the world around us. And here are people of faith that are doing the exact same thing 150 years ago, but their challenges are the development of electricity and automobiles, right? And ours are what do we do with social media, and it's okay to monetize Christian YouTube channels, which probably seem like a really foreign concept to totally alien to somebody that lived 20 years or 30 years before us. Linda.
I just have another story.
Yeah.
The same couple, when they first got married, he didn't realize that she didn't like making pickled herring. And he had to have
Oh yeah.
and she just couldn't stay at his house. And he came home one day and she forced herself to make pickled herring. And he could not find the can opener.
Oh no.
when she finished opening all the cans of the herring, she couldn't stand it. She did it every way. She included the can of
This is another fascinating thing, is what are the foods that you eat, right? So a lot of our perception of like what are Jewish foods comes out of Jews that immigrated to New York, right? So think about Jewish culture, and it's all like brisket. I mean, who's watched Marvelous and is Amazing, right? And you know, absorb that, you know. So brisket and matzah and pickled herring and latkes, gefilte fish, right? Which are foods that you can trace back to Polish Germanic ancestry. But in fact, again, even though most of the Jews in modern era live in the United States or Israel, the diversity of what are essentially ritual foods is really extreme. So if you're raised in, for example, a Sephardic Jewish household, your ritual food is not necessarily Germanic in nature, it's more Mediterranean in nature. So there might be some form of fish, but it's, you know, oftentimes accompanied with what we associate with, you know. So when I was in, this was a great thing about, here's my encouragement to visit Israel at some point, is they have the best hotel breakfasts ever. Because here's the thing, is that they've got a lot of people that are visiting, and when they are confronted with the question of what food do we have, so in other words, which traditions, foods do we incorporate, they say all of them. So you could have, we have pickled herring, smoked salmon, there's like 4 different types of fresh fish that were available. This was breakfast, mind you. They have various salads, they have flatbread, they have like baked bread, the whole leavened bread, excuse me, the whole American. My favorite, you know, I joke about this, was that apparently mimosas are a big part of Jewish breakfast. So they had a make your own mimosa. They had bottles of champagne just sitting there in ice with orange juice right next to it. And so the first day I flew in, I flew into Tel Aviv, which is where I met Len, who was working not far from there. And so I flew into Tel Aviv, stayed the night, woke up, went to get breakfast in the hotel, and I poured myself just a glass of champagne. And she's like, why are you so excited with orange juice? I said, no, I'm on vacation. I just want champagne. I don't want the orange juice to go along with it. But then when we went from Tel Aviv up to Haifa, which is another big modern city, which is connected to Akko, which is the city that's across the port, which is Akko is the old Crusader city that was established during the Middle Ages, which the old city still exists. Super cool. Haifa is also the home of the Baha'i religion, so the Baha'i gardens are in Haifa, if you know anything about that. Highly recommend visiting Haifa. When we got to Haifa, we stayed in a hotel there, exact same spread for breakfast. And then we went all the way to what used to be called Tiberias, which is a city on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. We stayed there, a much smaller hotel. Still have this gigantic breakfast. So if you want good breakfasts, go to Israel. We might actually wrap this up next week. Next week or the following, we'll see. We're close to finishing this up. So I just want to plug in. If you're thinking, if you got spare time, think of books of the Bible or topics that you want to talk about. And I want to do something that's less history-based, but more conversational, so things that we can open up a passage and have a conversation around. So if you've got something that you want to know, let me know. All right.